Max Verstappen has 4 world titles and 62 wins, but right now he is asking a question no dominant champion should ever ask. Is it still worth getting up for? The man who has defined this era of Formula 1 spoke one word after the Japanese Grand Prix. Het Leven, life. Not the car, not the championship, not the team, just life. And that single word, spoken quietly while the rest of the paddock packed up, carries more weight than any podium celebration ever could. The RB2 does not feel like a Formula 1 car to him. It feels like management, not racing. The new regulations split power 50-50 between the engine and the battery, turning every overtake into a calculation and every straight into a gamble. Verstappen built his career on instinct and bravery under braking, but now the driver who conserves best wins. Right, not the one who pushes hardest. His recovery to 6th in Melbourne earned him Driver of the Day, a consolation prize that said everything about how low expectations have fallen. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. This is not about one bad weekend or one difficult car. This is about a 4-time champion who sees the sport he loves changing into something he no longer recognizes. The contract he signed years ago contains an escape route, and the clock on that clause starts ticking in August. What happens next depends on a choice only one man can make, and that choice begins with understanding the rules that pushed him to the edge. Max Verstappen warned about this moment 3 years before it arrived, while he was still winning races with ease in 2023. He told anyone who would listen that the 2026 regulations would change racing into something unrecognizable. The new power units split output 50-50 between the engine and the battery, forcing drivers to think like accountants instead of racers. Every move now costs energy, and every straight becomes a calculation. What the telemetry actually shows is drivers spending up to 40% of their lap time managing deployment windows instead of chasing the perfect apex. Red Bull built their own power unit with Ford to close the gap to Mercedes, but the RB2 carries extra weight and lacks downforce through the corners. When Verstappen passes a rival on the straight, his battery depletes fast, leaving him vulnerable on the next one. The speed delta when the battery is empty can cost 3 to 5 seconds in top speed, turning a bold overtake into a temporary gain. This is not the racing he mastered, where bravery under braking decided the move. The sport now rewards the driver who conserves best, not the one who pushes hardest. But here is what no broadcast covered. The engineers inside the garage are already questioning whether the car can be fixed without changing the rules themselves. Verstappen's frustration is not about one slow weekend or one tricky circuit. It is about a fundamental mismatch between his driving DNA and a formula that asks him to manage instead of attack. If the rules that make racing less instinctive also make it less satisfying for the sport's greatest talent, what happens when the next race weekend begins? The answer starts with 3 races that turned concern into something far more serious. Melbourne exposed the first crack in the system. Both Red Bull cars rolled onto the grid with batteries completely empty before the race even started. Verstappen recovered to 6th place, but finished 54 seconds behind the winner, a gap that no amount of late race pushing could close. Shanghai made the problem worse when high humidity triggered an ERS cooling failure, forcing him to stop the car on lap 45. The data tells a completely different story than a simple bad start to the season. This is a pattern of systems struggling under the new energy management demands. Suzuka delivered the clearest evidence yet. Verstappen was eliminated in Q2 by Arvid Lindblad, a rookie in his first season with the Red Bull Junior program, finishing 1.2 seconds off the pole time. During the race, he passed Pierre Gasly in the final chicane, but had 0 battery power on the next straight, allowing Gasly to reclaim the position instantly. Sector 2 at Suzuka showed Verstappen losing 0.8 seconds per lap in mid-corner traction due to the RB2's unstable rear platform under energy deployment. Red Bull now sits 6th in the Constructors' Championship with 16 points after 3 rounds, their worst start in over a decade. This is the part that changes everything. 3 different circuits, 3 different failure modes, but the same underlying issue. The RB2 does not just lack pace. It fights its driver at every turn, asking him to conserve when his instinct is to attack. Verstappen's position 9th in the standings, 60 points behind the leader, is not a temporary slump. Oh, it is the mathematical result of a car that does not reward his greatest strengths. And when the paddock looks at these numbers, the reaction reveals a split that goes far deeper than lap times alone. Lewis Hamilton calls the 2026 season the best racing he has ever experienced, while Fernando Alonso describes the same corners as battery charging stations. Lando Norris, the reigning world champion, labels these cars the worst Formula One has ever built. 3 champions, 3 completely different views on the same rules. What no broadcast covered is this. Behind closed doors, 3 team principals privately admitted the 2026 rollout timeline was rushed to meet commercial deadlines, not engineering readiness. Martin Brundle tells drivers to get on with it or move on, while Damon Hill says unhappy champions should simply leave. This generational divide reveals how the sport values driver welfare versus commercial stability. Toto Wolff supports the new formula as pure racing, yet Alonso argues the sport has become the battery management world championship. The data tells a completely different story when you compare sector times. Hamilton thrives on strategic depth, gaining 0.3 seconds per lap through clever deployment, while pure speed drivers lose time managing energy windows instead of attacking corners. And that is where this story gets complicated, when the sport's most respected voices cannot agree on whether these rules represent progress or regression. Whose definition of fun gets to decide the future? The split among drivers is not just about preference, it is about identity. If the champions themselves are this divided, what does that mean for the fans who watch them and for the man who built his legacy on a version of racing that no longer exists? The answer begins with a word Verstappen used that no champion has ever dared to speak before. Verstappen used a word no champion has ever spoken about racing before. Angesund, unhealthy, not frustrating, not difficult, not challenging, unhealthy. This is not a complaint about car balance or strategy calls. This is a 4-time world champion describing the act of racing itself as a threat to his well-being. When the man who has won 62 Grands Prix says getting up for another race feels wrong, the sport needs to listen. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. During his break between China and Japan, Verstappen raced a Mercedes-AMG GT3 at the Nürburgring. He took pole by 2 seconds and won the 4-hour endurance event by nearly a minute. Veterans on the same grid admitted they had never seen the aero trick he discovered mid-race. He smiled throughout. The pace was undeniable. The joy was visible. This was the same driver who looked empty after Suzuka, yet here he was, dominant and alive. The real story was never about the lap time. Jos Verstappen has watched his son grow from a karting prodigy into a 4-time champion, and he sees something changing. Max once believed racing in a Formula One car was the most beautiful thing in the world. That belief is gone. When a driver finds more fulfillment in GT3 endurance racing on his days off than in the sport he dominates, the problem runs deeper than any technical fix. And that is where this story gets complicated. Because the contract Verstappen signed years ago contains a path out that few people understand. Max Verstappen built his exit strategy before the first 2026 car even turned a wheel. Back in early 2022, he negotiated a performance-based escape clause into his Red Bull contract, specifically because he worried about these regulations. If he ranks outside the top 2 in the championship between August and October, he can leave without penalty. What the data actually shows is Red Bull would need to improve by 0.4 seconds per lap just to close the gap to Mercedes and Ferrari by that deadline. With Verstappen currently 9th and 60 points behind the leader, the math is not on their side. The loss of Gianpiero Lambiase compounds the pressure. His race engineer of nearly a decade has signed to join McLaren in 2028. This starts removing a key emotional anchor from the garage. After China, Verstappen took the rare step of inviting both Lambiase and Laurent Mekies onto his private jet for a long, honest conversation about the team's direction. Nobody in that garage expected what came next. That kind of meeting does not happen when everything is fine. It happens when someone is weighing whether to stay. This is the part that changes everything. The clause was not added as a bluff. It was a safeguard against exactly this moment when the sport he mastered no longer feels like racing. If Verstappen triggers the escape route, Red Bull loses more than their lead driver. They lose their technical compass during the most unstable regulatory transition in years. And that is where this story gets complicated. because the rules themselves may now pose a risk far greater than performance alone. Oliver Burman's crash at Suzuka changed the conversation overnight. The 50G impact was not caused by driver error or mechanical failure. It happened because one car was in full boost mode while another was harvesting energy at reduced speed on the same straight. The speed difference between those two modes created a closing rate no driver could reasonably anticipate. When safety becomes a question, performance debates suddenly feel very small. This is the part that changes everything. Telemetry from that session showed a 45 kilometers per hour speed delta between boost and harvest modes in identical sectors. The FIA called an emergency technical meeting on April 9th with team technical directors and power unit suppliers. 6 solutions are now on the table, from adjusting superclipping power to mandating minimum speeds during energy harvesting. What no broadcast covered is this: any mid-season rule change would require homologation exceptions, giving teams with flexible architectures like Mercedes and Ferrari a massive advantage over cars built for a fixed philosophy. If the rules that make racing less instinctive also make it less safe, does the sport have a choice but to act? Toto Wolff supports the current formula, yet the data from Suzuka cannot be ignored. The 5-week break before Miami is not just downtime for drivers, it is a decision window for everyone involved. And that is where this story gets complicated, because the choice ahead is no longer just about winning races. It is about whether the sport itself still deserves the drivers who built it. The 5-week break before Miami is not a pause, it is a countdown. While the paddock waits for the next race, Verstappen will spend time alone, with family, weighing a choice that extends far beyond one season. He can adapt and fight, requiring a breakthrough the RB2 has not shown. He can pause and return later, following the path of champions who stepped away to rediscover their fire. Or he can walk away permanently, an unprecedented move for a dominant champion in his prime. What Verstappen did next left his own engineers questioning their data. If he stays, Red Bull gains precious time to develop, but Verstappen must reconcile his instincts with a formula that rewards calculation over courage. If he leaves, the sport loses its most compelling character during a fragile regulatory transition. Fan engagement could fracture, and the commercial value of the series might follow. The number Ferrari did not publish was the one that mattered most. Every team, every driver, every fan now watches a story that is no longer about lap times or podiums. This is the part that changes everything. When the man who mastered Formula One looks in the mirror and no longer recognizes the sport staring back, the question is not whether he will stay, it is whether the sport he loved is still worth saving. The lights will go out in Miami on May 3rd, and the answer will begin with one man's decision.